Hi, this is Ted, and for the next hour, you'll be listening to a reading of articles and features from the Monday, August 3rd edition of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And we'll begin with this. For Trump, the year is always 2020, by Katie Rogers. What year is it again? Over the past few days, Trump has been living in the year 2020, claiming that he defied his advisors to reopen the country during the coronavirus pandemic, saying that one of them, Dr. Anthony Fauci, was the one with all the crazy ideas. He has revisited his near-daily falsehood that he won the 2020 election and that it was rigged, a belief held by a large swath of his political base. And on Friday, he said that his supporters who ransacked the Capitol on January 6, 2021, were simply on an innocent journey. 4 people died that day. Trump is not so much a student of history as a rewriter of it. In his second term, he is so set on avenging his election loss and pursuing retribution against his political enemies that he has Americans looking backward when many have signaled they would rather be, he explained why the country is at war with Iran, or help them afford groceries now in the year 2026. Neither his falling poll numbers nor the concerns among Republicans about the midterms seem to be modulating his insistence on revisiting much of what happened 6 years ago. I don't think his ego allows him to accept the fact that someone he perceives as so weak as Joe Biden was able to beat him, said Sarah Matthews, who was a deputy press secretary in the first Trump administration and resigned amid the January 6th attacks. I witnessed it firsthand that he had advisors telling him he lost and there was no evidence of fraud, said Ms. Matthews. He stopped listening to those people and started surrounding himself with enablers and conspiracy theorists. 6 years later, she said that Americans are still living with the consequences, in the sense that he's not focusing on the things that most Americans are focused on. In a statement, Abigail Jackson, a White House spokeswoman, suggested that Trump's fixation on the 2020 election was part of an effort to pass the Save America Act, which would require voters to prove their citizenship to register, ban IDs without a photo at polling places, and severely restrict voting by mail. Democrats have argued that the legislation would make it more difficult for eligible voters, including women who have married and taken on their husbands' names, to make it to the polls. The president knows how critical this issue is for the American people, and he will not stop fighting until it's passed, she said. The Trump administration continues to lower drug prices, restore American jobs, restore gold standard science, and more, she said. Last week, Senate Republicans joined Trump back in 2020. Revisiting a collective national trauma far more complicated than how they presented it, Senate Republicans trumpeted Dr. Fauci's journal entries, recovered from a government server and shared with the public courtesy of Trump's health secretary, Robert Kennedy Jr. In them, Fauci wrote of all the attention that he received from celebrities like Julia Roberts and Barbra Streisand. Dr. Fauci invoked the Fifth Amendment over 100 times on Wednesday during a hearing before the Senate Homeland Security Committee. To many, this was a tacit admission of guilt from the 85-year-old who retired from public service in 2022. Trump, by the way, pleaded the Fifth hundreds of times during the 2022 fraud trial, according to publicly available documents. In his journals, Dr. Fauci detailed his deteriorating relationship with Mr. Trump as they disagreed over experimental treatments for the virus, mask guidance, testing availability, and school closures. There was tension as far back as January 2020, when the president was downplaying the spread of the mysterious virus. Dr. Fauci wrote of a television appearance he made at that time, "I had to answer that we were taking this very seriously and that Americans should not be frightened or worried. Let me see if this pits me against the POTUS." Turns out he was right to be wary. Trump has lumped Dr. Fauci in with a long list of political enemies he believes he made during the last year of his first term. That list includes Joseph Biden Jr. Last month, Trump veered off course during events that were supposed to be about U.S. nuclear capability and manufacturing and the environment to insult his successor. He also claimed on social media that he had warned Biden about Dr. Fauci, despite the fact that Trump gave the doctor a presidential commendation for his work to bring COVID vaccine to the public. Trump wrote, "I called Biden to tell him Fauci was no good, either didn't have a clue or was dishonest. The call was well received, but sadly not acted on." He went on to give Fauci vast destructive power. Two people directly familiar with Biden's conversations with Trump, who were granted anonymity because they didn't want to get into a public back and forth with the president, say that call did not happen. A former senior administration official who was part of the first-time White House coronavirus task force and was granted anonymity to avoid getting into a public spat with former colleagues, recalled that Trump and his advisors would frequently disagree with Dr. Fauci in Situation Room meetings about the virus. Dr. Fauci's refrain during tense moments was to tell members of that group that his job was to make science-based recommendations. The job of White House officials, he said, was to weigh those recommendations against potential economic harm. Trump's retellings have, at a minimum, stripped nuance from matters as complex as his handling of a virus outbreak that would kill over 1 million people. In Trump's version of events, there is only good and bad, hero and villain, with him or against him. Thomas Popinski, a political scientist and co-author of Pandemic Politics, The Deadly Toll of Partisanship in the Age of COVID, said that this binary approach was evident during the pandemic and may have cost Trump the election that he cannot stop obsessing about. The main finding was that the Trump administration interpreted the pandemic as a political threat, said Mr. Popinski. It was a tactical error. He could have been reelected if he had treated the pandemic differently. Trump's constant incorrect assertions about the 2020 election results have carried a cost for American democracy. A raft of polls have found a deepening distrust in government institutions and election security, but a partisan split in the reasons why. According to a Politico poll published in May, a majority of Republicans are worried about ineligible people voting, while a majority of Democrats are worried about voter suppression. Many Americans remain legitimately angry and upset about what happened to them and their families during the pandemic. And experts like Mr. Popinski see a missed opportunity to learn from mistakes that were made in 2020. Americans now face a growing measles outbreak and fears about food supply contamination. Asked last week about an outbreak of cyclosporiasis, a diarrhea-causing illness whose recent spread has been linked to contaminated iceberg lettuce, Trump shrugged off concerns. "I haven't thought about it," he said before joking with the reporter who asked the question, "Are you eating lettuce recently?" People who know how Trump operates believe he will persist with his focus on the events of 2020, given the main lesson he seems to have learned from that time period. Facts have not gotten in the way of his opinions, and he has been rewarded for it. If he says something enough times, he has the world's largest megaphone, said Ms. Matthews. Of course, there are going to be millions of Americans who are going to believe him and take him at his word, even if he has no evidence to back it up. This is a brief article. Prosecutor in D.C. moves to dismiss more reflecting pool cases, by Clarence Williams. Prosecutors in Washington are dropping charges against 3 more defendants who had been accused of vandalizing the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool. The motions to dismiss the 3 misdemeanor cases coincide with the decision last week to drop the most serious of the cases, the felony prosecution of a former Olympian who prosecutors had accused of damaging the pool. The U.S. Attorney, Jeanine Pirro, abruptly abandoned the 4 cases after investigators concluded that botched work by a contractor, not vandalism, was the primary cause of widespread damage to the pool's new blue lining. Trump has been fixated for months on the condition of the reflecting pool, which has been plagued for years by water leaking out between its long concrete slabs. This year, the Interior Department, which oversees the site, gave a no-bid contract to fix the pool to Atlantic Industrial Coatings, a small Virginia firm. After pieces of the pool's new blue lining began to peel up, the president and administration officials blamed several people who had been arrested and charged with vandalizing the pool. But the extraordinary motions filed in the District of Columbia Superior Court over the last few days indicated that the problems that had drawn the president's ire were caused by a faulty repair job, not by vandals. David Hearn, a former Olympic canoeist, was the one defendant who was facing a felony charge, and on Friday, it was his case that the U.S. Attorney's Office moved first to dismiss. Ms. Pirro's filing on Friday said that prosecutors had determined the damage was the result of a botched installation and not vandalism. Along with Mr. Hearn, prosecutors moved to drop charges against 3 others, who all were charged with destruction of property less than $1,000. G. Allen Dale, who represents one of them, said prosecutors had contacted him in an email to state their intent to drop the case. He and I are both very happy this case is over. It probably shouldn't have been brought in the first place, Mr. Dale said. At least this nightmare is over for him. On Friday, Ms. Pirro said Interior Department officials initially misled prosecutors by blaming vandals for damage, when, in fact, the new blue coating installed by contractors had actually started to fail within 2 days of the project's completion. Ms. Pirro blamed Atlantic Industrial Coatings for a flawed installation in the administration's rush to complete the project ahead of the America 250 celebration on July 4th. Earlier this summer, federal officials said at least 7 people had been accused of vandalizing the pool, but the identity of the other people and the status of any cases against them could not be immediately determined. Timothy Lauer, a spokesman for the U.S. Attorney's Office, declined to comment. Jameson Kohler, a lawyer who represents another defendant, said his client was relieved the charges were being dropped after she had faced threats of jail time and had been petrified to learn the President of the United States was threatening to bring full force of the U.S. criminal justice against her and others. He added that while the case has been dropped for now, he considers a possibility a charge could resurface. He said, "This administration is so petty and so manipulative, there is always the fear that they might recharge the defendant." You might recall that either last week or the week before, I read an article about the new Texas public school book list. Here's an essay about that. "The most radical thing about Texas's book list isn't the Bible," by James Traub. Earlier this summer, the Texas State Board of Education approved a mandatory reading list for public school students that includes fairy tales and nursery rhymes for little children, stories of America's founders and Aesop's fables for elementary schoolers, poems by Rudyard Kipling and Langston Hughes for middle schoolers, Shakespeare's plays and Dante's Inferno for high schoolers, and passages or stories from the Bible for every grade save kindergarten. In our highly decentralized educational system, states don't tell teachers what books to assign. The model Texas will begin implementing in 2030 makes it an outlier. Yet almost all of the reaction to the list, pro and con, has centered on the Bible. The Freedom from Religion Foundation, an organization that promotes strict separation of church and state, described the list as a brazen promotion of religious doctrine that threatens to convert public schools into Sunday schools. This is a wild overreaction to what is, after all, a tiny fraction of the required readings. What's worse, the whole debate obscures the pedagogical radicalism of what Texas has done in issuing a mandatory reading list full of classic works at all. I spent the 2023-2024 academic year in public schools across the country researching a book on civic education. I was braced for the culture war in the classroom. Conservative versions of history in red states, progressive versions in blue ones. And I did see that. What I had not expected to find was that the pedagogical and curricular problems in American schools are more damaging than the political ones. Most students, even in the well-regarded high schools I visited, knew precious little about American history and government and had only a hazy sense of chronology. Teachers in English classes complained that students would not read whole novels. and so they didn't assign them. There are many culprits for this failure, including everyone's favorite, children's addiction to social media. But the root of the problem lies in the way we think about teaching and learning. The view that has dominated education schools for several generations holds that students learn by mastering general critical thinking skills that can be applied across disciplines and occasions. If you learn to find the main idea, you can navigate through texts. If you can recognize and articulate perspectives, you can make sense of a primary document in history. Quick pause. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This doctrine makes, quote, content, that is, the specific material from which these skills derive, a secondary consideration. Combined with children's real or apparent resistance to struggling with difficult material, that leads many teachers to choose works that pose the fewest challenges or have the most surface appeal. Short excerpts from classics or young adult novels about troubled teens. Texas seeks to solve that problem not only by requiring schools across the state to teach specific books, but by choosing works that are, with some telling exceptions, rich in language, ideas, and feeling. The list is meant to constitute only part of each year's reading curriculum. The rest will be supplied by local schools and teachers. More than that, the list embodies a very different pedagogical theory, one most famously propounded by E.D. Hirsch in his 1987 best-selling book, Cultural Literacy and Other Works. Literacy, Hirsch argued, is context-specific. We do not become good readers and learners by mastering generalizable skills, but rather by acquiring the vocabulary, grammatical knowledge, and stock of information that allow us to make sense of a text. A child who knows a lot about baseball will do a better job reading and summarizing a passage on baseball than a child with a higher reading level but no knowledge of the subject. From this perspective, it's better to read a classic than a relatable contemporary story, not only because one is beautiful and the other is not, but because a classic, by the very fact of its persistence over time, has become part of our shared culture. It thus increases our conversancy with all the texts from the culture. That is why it makes sense for fifth graders in Texas to read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, The Phantom Toll Booth, Paul Revere's Ride, and even, speaking of baseball, Casey at the Bat. Although it has received less attention, Texas has also created a new social studies curriculum that embodies a kindred principle to that behind the reading list. You cannot learn to think like a historian until you have gained fluency in the materials of which history is made: dates, places, events, names. Children in Texas will start studying chronological history in third grade, a time when social studies is often devoted to broad themes like community. Fifth graders will be expected to explain how the Protestant Reformation encouraged people to question religious and political authority, and why Montesquieu believed in divided government and the like, according to a draft of the new curriculum. The Texas model will not suit everyone. The state's idea of classic literature might not pass muster in, say, California. While educators everywhere regard Pericles' funeral oration, which Texas students are to read in high school, as a rhetorical masterpiece, they may not feel the same way about Margaret Thatcher's eulogy for Ronald Reagan, or the works of Ayn Rand and the conservative black economist Thomas Sowell, which are also assigned. Although 53% of students in Texas public schools are Hispanic, the state school board included only a few Hispanic authors in the reading list. Those choices reflect Texas's conservatism. There's nothing inherently conservative about the idea of a stipulated reading list, and about the belief that children need to be exposed from an early age to great works of literature and to history taught chronologically, that they should memorize poems and speeches, that they should learn grammar. A different reading list could achieve the same goals. Cultural literacy is not a Procrustean bed. As we become more diverse and less anchored in the Western tradition, what it means to be conversant in our culture changes as well. After my book was published, I was contacted by some of the leading philanthropic funders of public schools. They wanted to talk about how they could help improve civic education. Here's an idea for them. Raise Texas's bet by promoting an equally rich reading list suitable for students in blue states. Show the world that academic rigor is not just for conservatives. And here's a little change of pace. It's still worrying. Honey, Call the Bee Vet by Emily Anthus. At the University of Georgia's Veterinary Teaching Hospital, aspiring animal doctors learn to minister to a menagerie: dogs with dermatitis and horses with colic, diabetic cats and malnourished parrots, bleeding rabbits and wheezing snakes. Whatever hops through the door, said Dr. Jorg Meyer, an exotic animal vet at the hospital, or slithers. But on a breezy Sunday morning in April, Dr. Meyer was in a small, overgrown field teaching students how to make house calls on a group of patients that rarely made it through the hospital door or onto the standard veterinary curriculum. The students climbed into stiff white jumpsuits, donned protective mesh hoods, and prepared to make the rounds on hundreds of thousands of honeybees. Everybody ready? Dr. Meyer asked. Over the next 2 hours, the students examined more than a dozen hives, holding the wax combs up to the sun and searching for signs of disease, the stunted wings, discolored larvae, or minuscule mites that can spell serious trouble for the nation's bees and, by extension, its food supply. Honeybees are agricultural all-stars, pollinating roughly $15 billion worth of crops, more than 130 types of fruit, vegetables, and nuts every year. They are also increasingly in danger, plagued by parasites and pathogens, and weakened by climate change, pesticides, and malnutrition. Mass die-offs have become commonplace. During the 2024 to 2025 season, the U.S. lost more than half of its managed honeybee colonies. Beekeepers are fighting a war trying to keep their bees alive, said Bob Binney, a commercial beekeeper who owns the Blue Ridge Honey Company in Lakemont, Georgia. The honeybee medicine program at the U of Georgia is part of a nascent but growing effort to enlist veterinarians in the fight. Most veterinary students are already required to master the biological basics of a range of domestic creatures, such as dogs, cats, horses, cows, and pigs. Said Dr. Meyer, I think the honeybee deserves a similar status. If half of the nation's dogs or cats or cows or horses were to unexpectedly drop dead every winter, it would be an animal health emergency. Yet in beekeeping, it's basically called Wednesday, Dr. Meyer said. It's considered totally normal. Dr. Meyer, who grew up in a tiny agricultural town in southwestern Germany, spent much of his childhood around farm animals. But when he began veterinary school in Budapest, he found himself drawn to birds, lizards, and the exotic creatures about which much less was known. He also fell in love with honeybees. Unlike in the United States, many European vet schools made, that's my phone beeping, by the way, ignore it. Unlike in the United States, many European vet schools made honeybee health part of the curriculum, presenting the invertebrates as basically micro-livestock, Dr. Meyer said. Honeybee medicine was offbeat enough to capture his attention. I also thought that's super romantic, having your own bees making your own honey, he said. And in the early 2000s, after he took a job as an exotic animal vet in the United States, he got a few hives of his own. By then, it was clear that honeybees were facing serious threats. Varroa destructor, an invasive parasitic mite that feeds on living bees, was at the top of the list, but dozens of dangers lurked. Wax moths, hive beetles, digestion disrupting fungi, viruses that caused paralysis or wing deformities, bacteria that could wipe out all of a colony's young. For years, American beekeepers managed outbreaks mostly on their own, diagnosing many diseases visually and then administering their preferred treatments. The fact that beekeepers could buy antibiotics over the counter without consulting a veterinarian helped enable this self-sufficiency. But in 2017, amid concern about the rise of antibiotic-resistant microbes, Federal regulators tightened access to antibiotics. Suddenly, beekeepers who wanted to use the drugs needed veterinarians. There was just one problem. In the U.S., we weren't well trained for taking care of honeybees, said Dr. Tracy Ferrone, a veterinarian at Grove City College in Pennsylvania. Since 2017, several professional organizations, including a newly formed Honeybee Veterinary Consortium, have been trying to bring practicing vets up to speed, creating continuing education courses and special certifications. Interest in the subject has been growing, experts said. We certainly have made some great strides, said Dr. Ferrone, who now studies and teaches about honeybee health. When I go to veterinary conferences and speak about honeybees, my rooms are full. She added, it's not another dog diarrhea lecture, right? But the knowledge gap is large. In one survey conducted in 2023-2024, 74% of veterinarians said that they did not know how to write honeybee prescriptions. 89% indicated that they would be unable to identify honeybee diseases. So some veterinary schools have also been working to give the next generation of vets a better grounding in bees. Having the vets come in is really needed because it's so hard for the bees and the beekeepers right now, said Megan Milbrath, who established and now leads a honeybee medicine program at Michigan State and was an author of the Vet Survey. We just really need all hands on deck. At the University of Georgia, Dr. Meyer figured that he was well positioned to help vet students get a handle on honeybees. After the FDA rule change, he said he asked himself, well, why don't I just combine my hobby, the beekeeping, with my job? He teamed up with colleagues at the university's agriculture school, which was already home to a renowned bee lab and beekeeper certification program. Together, they created a program in honeybee medicine, which now includes a bee club, a bee treatment crew, and a 3-week elective rotation. Madison Morgan, a fourth-year vet student from Austell, Georgia, surprised herself by signing up for all of it. She had arrived at school with no particular interest in bees. They weren't on my radar in the slightest, she said. But when she heard about the bee club, she was intrigued, and Dr. Meyer's enthusiasm won her over. It ended up being a newfound love that I was not expecting, she said, and she ultimately became the manager of the bee treatment crew. Seeing a bee return to the hive, transporting thick clumps of pollen on its legs, has become as exciting as watching her dog learn a new trick. When we see them coming with pollen pants, we're so proud of that bee, she said. But in some ways, bees challenge a central tenet of veterinary medicine, in which the life of each individual animal matters. We all love animals, and we're like, oh, we want to save each and every one, she said. That approach makes little sense for honeybees, which have lifespans that can be measured in weeks and can survive only as part of a larger colony. Colonies are often described as superorganisms, with the bees working collectively to perform some basic biological functions. So in honeybee medicine, the bee is not the patient, the hive is. The vet school's teaching apiary had 13 of them, each housed in a tower of stacked boxes that grew taller as the colony expanded. The students on the bee treatment crew inspect the hives every week. They begin by examining the debris that accumulates at the bottom of each hive. Pollen grains and wax flakes are normal byproducts of a healthy active colony. But finding hive beetles, mummified bee larvae, or lots of tiny reddish-brown specks, varroa mites, on the bottom board can spell trouble. The students also assess the wooden frames inside each hive, which hold the wax combs that bees use to store their food and raise their young. Is there enough pollen, nectar, and honey to keep the colony nourished? Do the bees need more space? Are there signs of pests or pathogens? On that breezy Sunday morning in April, the inspections did turn up 2 varroa mites, which was no cause for panic. The mites have become so widespread that it's not unusual to find a few in a hive. Treatment would not be required unless the mite population rose. Although varroa can bring down even the strongest hive, healthy, well-fed colonies can keep some pests and pathogens in check on their own, said Louis Bartlett, who leads research at the U of Georgia's Bee Lab. But if we run out of good food for them because we've seen losses of pollinator habitat, and we're poisoning them with all these insecticides and fungicides and other agrochemicals that we know inhibit their immune systems, then you can get these large outbreaks. So the program encouraged students to think holistically about hive health, teaching them about the nutritional principles and environmental conditions that could protect bees and beekeepers from large-scale losses. If you get called out to an apiary, Dr. Myers said, you don't want to be that guy that just drives around in a station wagon and writes a prescription and says, see you later. Dr. Meyer doesn't expect his students to orient their entire careers around bees, but hopes that they will feel comfortable taking on beekeepers as customers. Indeed, Ms. Morgan recently decided to specialize in surgery, but she said she hopes to be a resource for local beekeepers and to keep her own hives at home. Of course, that was how Dr. Meyer started, with just a casual beekeeping hobby and a separate professional specialty. Now, even his work with exotic animals incorporates bees. He has used honey, which may speed the healing of certain wounds, to treat injured turtles and armadillos, and is investigating whether bee products might have benefits for animals with cancer. Bees, he said, have really taken over my life. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Trump's meddling in Justice Department causes problems of his own making. This is by Alan Foyer. From the moment Trump was reelected, he has muscled his way into the driver's seat at the Justice Department, leaving tread marks on its time-honored independence from the White House by demanding and sometimes directing investigations into his enemies. But his tight grip on the steering wheel has often threatened to lead the department off a cliff. Last week offered a particularly vivid portrait of the consequences of Trump's meddling, which, in the span of only a few days, imperiled one criminal case, set the stage for sanctions in a second, and gummed up the chances that his pick for Attorney General will be confirmed by the Senate. Trump has long believed that he is his own best advisor, and that as the leader of the executive branch, he enjoys complete control over the agencies beneath him. But there's a reason the department in charge of federal law enforcement has traditionally stood outside of the president's personal purview, said Norm Eisen, a lawyer involved in some of the recent cases, who earlier in his career worked on the Obama administration's no-contact policy with the Justice Department. Mr. Eisen said, when presidents meddle in the department, it tends to disrupt its normal functioning. The problems last week began on Wednesday when lawyers for James Comey, the former FBI director, filed court papers revealing that Secret Service agents who questioned their client about a photograph he posted showing seashells on a beach arranged to read 8647 were ordered to quickly send a summary of the interview to Trump on Air Force One. The interview was a hot topic on the plane, and the president was very interested, the filing said. In fact, it added, Trump wanted to use the agent's notes as fodder at a coming media appearance, even though they presumably contained sensitive and unverified investigative information. The request for the notes was a shocking breach of the distance that most presidents have kept from the day-to-day oversight of criminal investigations and indicated the intensity of Trump's personal involvement in the pursuit of Comey, one of his most reviled political adversaries. But his insistence on interfering with the case could come back to haunt him. After all, Comey's lawyers pointed to the episode as evidence that the Justice Department had indicted him on charges of making threats against the president, only as an act of retribution. If that claim is proven true, it would result in the case being dismissed. Trump's intrusive instincts also played a role last week in the demise of another criminal case, one that accused the former Olympic canoeist David Hearn with vandalizing one of the president's pet projects, the Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool. When Jeanine Pirro, the U.S. Attorney in Washington, announced the indictment of Mr. Hearn last month, she made it clear that the charges had been brought, at least in part, because Trump wanted them. This is not only a priority for the president, she told reporters, but for myself. On Friday night, however, the case fell apart in a spectacular fashion. Ms. Pirro, in a court filing, suddenly acknowledged that new information from Trump's Interior Department had made her realize that shoddy construction, Not anything that Mr. Hearn had done caused the problems with the pool's lining. But even that confession did not stop Trump from doubling down on the vandalism narrative. On Saturday morning, he posted a message on social media saying that he disagreed entirely with Ms. Pirro, a veteran prosecutor and a friend of his for more than 40 years. I don't know what she was thinking, Trump wrote. While Mr. Hearn's lawyers have not disclosed what they might do next, the case's collapse gives them an opening to argue that the president's stubborn statements about the matter suggest the prosecution was vexatious, frivolous, or brought in bad faith. Should a move like that succeed, it would add to the roster of Ms. Pirro's failures to go after Trump's enemies, a list that already includes 6 Democratic lawmakers accused of sedition by the president after they posted a video reminding military personnel of their obligation to ignore illegal orders. It would also allow Mr. Hearn to recoup legal fees for the cast of lawyers he hired to defend himself. The president also intervened on another important bit of business at the Justice Department, the effort to confirm Todd Blanche, Mr. Trump's former personal lawyer, as Attorney General. As the week came to an end, Mr. Blanche seemed well on his way to removing the main hurdle to his appointment, calming the concerns expressed by 2 Republican senators, John Cornyn of Texas and Thom Tillis of North Carolina. The lawmakers have repeatedly voiced unhappiness with the $1.8 billion compensation fund and the extraordinary personal tax protections that emerged this spring from Trump's deal to drop his lawsuit against the Internal Revenue Service. But as the weekend neared, the president seemed to throw Mr. Blanche under the bus that he himself was driving, issuing a series of confusing and contradictory messages. On Friday, he appeared to step back from his earlier threat to withdraw Mr. Blanche's nomination and repeated his support for creating the fund, which Mr. Blanche had already said was dead. On Saturday, Trump again asserted that he would revive the fund, which could be used to compensate rioters who stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021, if the Senate did not confirm Mr. Blanche. Mr. Tillis, for one, seemed baffled and dispirited by Trump's chaotic interference in the confirmation process, holding out hope that the president's back-and-forth approach would end before the Senate went on summer recess early this week. It's unfortunate that Todd Blanche, whom I consider well qualified for the job, will not be confirmed because of this reversal, Mr. Tillis wrote. Hopefully we can resolve this by Tuesday. There appeared to be a breakthrough on the matter late Sunday night when Blanche posted 2 documents, a signed memo in which he said that the Justice Department was formally rescinding an order that created the fund, and an unsigned statement in which the agency clarified the terms of the tax protections. Blanche's message said that the documents had emerged from good faith discussions with senators, and by Monday afternoon, Trump was insisting he had not signed off on the revised plan. I didn't look at it, Trump said. All I know is that Todd Blanche is great. And for those who care about national parks and monuments, here's a story that says, Documents Undercut Trump's Claims about Utah National Monument by Maxine Joselo. When President Trump sharply reduced the size of Bears Ears National Monument in Utah by more than 1.2 million acres, he claimed it was necessary because recreation was virtually impossible within the site's boundaries. You can't go hunting, you can't go fishing, you can't do anything, you can virtually not even walk on it, Trump said. The number 2 official at the Interior Department, Kate McGregor, chimed in saying, That's exactly right, sir. So you are remedying that today. But recreation has been allowed in Bears Ears since President Barack Obama designated the monument in 2016. And government documents reviewed by the New York Times show that Trump administration officials were briefed on recreational opportunities inside the monument about a month before the Oval Office event. Utah officials who pushed for shrinking the monument told the Trump administration in June that there was current recreational access to Bears Ears, according to the documents, which the Times obtained via a public records request. The state officials specifically cited 2 trails, popular among hikers, backpackers, and off-road vehicle drivers, the documents show. Other trails attract scores of horseback riders, mountain bikers, and rock climbers, as Mr. Obama noted when he designated the monument. The document suggests that the administration was lying or spreading misinformation about these fantastic public lands when it justified cutting the protected areas, said Steve Block, the legal director at the nonprofit Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, who reviewed the records at the request of the Times. National monuments are public lands that are legally protected from oil and gas drilling, mining, and other industrial development. They have similar protections as national parks, but while national parks are created by Congress, national monuments can be created by presidents through the Antiquities Act of 1906. Taylor Rogers, a White House spokeswoman, did not answer the questions about the documents, but said in an email that the Obama and Biden administrations abused the Antiquities Act to lock up millions of acres of Utah's public lands, impoverishing local communities and sharply restricting access for recreation, grazing, resource development, and fire prevention. Charlotte Taylor, a spokeswoman for the Interior Department, also did not address the documents, but said in an email that previous administrations shut hunters, anglers, and other sportsmen out of land they had accessed for generations. Trump signed executive orders last month to cut Bears Ears and a second national monument in Utah, Grand Staircase Escalante, by more than 90%. The orders opened both sites, which are known for their sandstone canyons and vast mesas, to oil drilling, uranium mining, and other commercial activities. During his first term, Trump shrank Bears Ears by 85% and cut Grand Staircase nearly in half. But tribes and environmentalists sued over the move, saying the Antiquities Act authorized presidents to designate monuments, but not to abolish or shrink them. President Biden subsequently restored sweeping protections to both sites before a court could issue a final decision. Trump's second term cuts are even bigger. The new documents reviewed by the Times show that Reg Johnson, the director of Utah's Public Lands Policy Coordinating Office, sent a memo in June to Sam Crofts, a senior advisor at the Interior Department, detailing Bears Ears history, geology, and recreational opportunities. The memo said that a route called the Peavine Corridor was open to off-road vehicles and provided motorized access deep into the area. It added that backpackers often use Rig Canyon as a junction point on massive wilderness loops, including a popular 40-mile loop. Mr. Crofts, a former policy director for Senator Mike Lee, a Republican of Utah, did not respond to a request for comment. Representatives for Utah's Public Lands Policy Coordinating Office also did not return a request for comment. Bears Ears is the ancestral homeland of 5 tribes in the region: the Navajo Nation, Hopi Tribe, Ute Indian Tribe, Ute Mountain Ute Tribe, and Pueblo of Zuni. It contains thousands of archaeological sites that tribes consider culturally significant, including the remains of burial grounds, cliff dwellings, and rock art panels. The monument also boasts a world-class outdoor recreation opportunities, Mr. Obama wrote in his proclamation designating Bears Ears, which cited rock climbing, hunting, hiking, backpacking, canyoneering, whitewater rafting, mountain biking, and horseback riding. Lewis Williams, the founder and owner of Ancient Waves River and Hiking Adventures, which provides tours of Bears Ears led by indigenous guides, said he watched live as Trump signed the executive order to shrink the monuments. "I was shaking my head," Mr. Williams said. "I was like, I wonder if he's ever been here to this region, because if he knew this region, he would find out this place is totally accessible." But Ben Burr, the executive director of the Blue Ribbon Coalition, a group that pushes to open public lands to off-road vehicles, said he supported Trump's move. He noted that the Biden administration proposed a plan to prohibit off-road vehicles across 600,000 acres of the monument, though it never took effect. Nobody ever felt these restrictions because the plan was adopted in the final midnight hours of the Biden administration, and then it was never actually enforced, he said. So we think that the discussion around what was allowed and not allowed in these monuments has been kind of obfuscated by that. The documents did not mention hunting or fishing, but the Utah Department of Natural Resources, which houses the Public Lands Policy Coordinating Office, allows people to hunt and fish in Bears Ears if they have valid licenses and tags. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And here's an opinion piece by M. Gesson. Trump is trying to force Americans to unlearn what we know. We live in a country with an unpredictable past. This was a saying among the intelligentsia in the Soviet Union when I was growing up. We never knew which part of our history would be obliterated next. Now Americans too live in a country with an unpredictable past. 2 months into his second term, Trump issued an executive order titled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History, in which he directed officials to remove improper ideology, his words, from the Smithsonian and its museums, to cut funding to programs that degrade shared American values, and to reinstate some monuments removed following the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests. A very incomplete list of things that have happened since that order was issued. The National Park Service has been removing signs about slavery. The statue of a Confederate general has been reinstalled in Washington. A scathing report by the White House Domestic Policy Council accused the Smithsonian of using history as a political instrument to divide, dispirit, and discourage our citizens. And on July 24th, Trump issued a new executive order mandating that signs be installed outside the Smithsonian, warning visitors about the ideological capture at the National Museum of American History. Reevaluating history has the potential to change a people's future by changing its self-understanding. It can unite people in a genuinely new project. And then there is the rewriting of history, which is crazy-making. The Soviet Union repeatedly forced the whole country to unlearn what was already widely known. In the 1950s, after Joseph Stalin died, the Communist Party denounced his cult of personality and some of the extent of his terror. A decade later, it reversed itself, exiling or imprisoning authors who wrote about the crimes of Stalinism. The same process was repeated when the Soviet Union collapsed. Vast amounts of information about Soviet terror emerged. Under Vladimir Putin, that knowledge has been forced back into oblivion. Trump wants Americans to unlearn what they have come to know about the history and legacy of enslavement. What his executive orders really promise to restore is a sense of comfort contained in the most reductive and sanitized stories about the United States, the bliss of ignorance. Trump appears to believe that the job of museums and memorials is to instill pride in the hearts of all Americans, as one of the executive orders put it. The report from Trump's Domestic Policy Council faulted the National Museum of American History for failing in this precise mission. A couple of months ago, I visited Montgomery, Alabama, where an organization called the Equal Justice Initiative is undertaking a very different project. It is telling the story of Black Americans. The EJI has so far built a lynching memorial, a legacy museum, a vast sculpture garden, and a public square with a permanent exhibit on the civil rights movement. Each element of the complex, which is still growing, is as powerful as any museum or memorial I have visited. Brian Stevenson, who leads the EJI, is a litigator whose clients have included Black men on death row and children tried as adults and sentenced to life in prison. He came to feel, however, that the change he could achieve in the courts was not enough. The real evil, he told me, the enduring evil, was the narrative we created to justify enslavement. It's a striking statement. Can stories really do as much harm as a vast infrastructure of violence and cages? His point is that the stories underlie the violence. Stories that systematically rendered Black people as less than human enabled enslavement and segregation. Stories that rendered Black people as dangerous and predatory fueled lynching and mass incarceration. Unless we create new stories, the abuse will never stop. Stevenson, too, talks about pride. States like Alabama have very little to be proud about, he told me. Montgomery's days of wealth and glory are in the past. It's a city with dozens of monuments to the Confederacy, a city where 1 in 5 people lives in poverty, in a state with one of the highest incarceration rates in the country. But the EJI's museums and memorials have made Montgomery a tourist destination, and that is a direct economic benefit for the city. Most important, these institutions have helped to make Montgomery a center for engagement with American history. Stevenson believes that the conversations they foster can and should make people proud. He cites as one of his inspirations the German Holocaust memorials and museums that make the promise of never again a profoundly hopeful message. My traveling companions, I'm sorry about the beeping. My traveling companions couldn't help noticing that when Stevenson described actions the U.S. had taken to oppress black people, he said we instead of the government or racist lawmakers. We asked him why. I refuse to give America to anyone else, he explained. That is one way to interpret the word inclusion in DEI, a story in which your ancestors aren't elided. Stevenson has not received any federal or state funding for his sites. The Trump administration, therefore, cannot target them for defunding. But Montgomery exemplifies the conflict at the root of Trumpian memory politics. I went to Montgomery with my wife, Lynn, and 4 of my former colleagues from Russia who now live in exile. After a few days there, we drove to Charlottesville, Virginia, the site of the 2017 Unite the Right rally, during which white supremacists flooded into town, ostensibly to defend a monument to the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, and counter-protesters showed up in droves to oppose their message. Trump remarked that there had been very fine people on both sides. Today, a bald rectangular patch in an otherwise green lawn downtown is all that remains of the statue, which was removed 4 years after the rally. The city plans to install a sculpture of a baobab tree there, created from the melted bronze of Lee's statue. But when I was there, I didn't see any marker indicating what had happened. The result is a sort of memorial visible only to those who know what to look for, a perfect symbol of both what was and was not accomplished in the nation's last attempt at a racial reckoning. Another such symbol is Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's residence and plantation just outside Charlottesville. All visitors of the house are required to sign up for a tour, a tightly scripted affair that, if you listen closely, bears the signs of numerous edits made over the years. The original narrative is one of progress, precisely the narrative that the Trump executive orders demand. Jefferson was a man of science and a lover of art. He brought progressive political ideas and maps and clocks and advanced engineering and neoclassical architecture and French food to Monticello. But this story is now interrupted repeatedly by inconvenient facts that used to be elided. Jefferson was a slave owner who fathered at least 6 children with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman with whom he had a sexual relationship when she was a teenager, and he was a middle-aged widower. There's a separate tour about slavery at Monticello, but the main tour did not acknowledge the tension between the core story and these additional facts. Here's a juxtaposition that stayed with me. Jefferson's daughter by his late wife lived in the house with him, as did her 11 children, whom she educated in keeping with Enlightenment ideals. The children Jefferson had with Hemings lived in the slave quarters and were put to work on the estate from a young age. While my fellow exiles and I were traveling on the American South, the campaign against memory continued back in our homeland. Putin's government had long since shuttered Memorial, an organization devoted to preserving the memory of Stalinist terror. In April of this year, the Russian Supreme Court declared Memorial an extremist organization. 2 years ago, the government closed the Gulag Museum in Moscow. In June, it was reopened as the Memory Museum, telling the story of Nazi crimes against the Soviet people. The memory of Stalinist terror has once again been ordered obliterated. Ilya Vinyavkin, one of my traveling companions, a historian of Stalinism. He observed that Stevenson's project is, in a way, more ambitious than anything Russian memory activists have tried to do. It draws a direct narrative line from the past to the present. It makes the argument that the way we live now is shaped by the way our forebears organized society. This is exactly what can make the project of revisiting the past so vital. It's not about the past. It's about choosing our future. Do we want a future that challenges us to reckon with the truth and find ways, genuinely new and inventive ways, to deliver on the American promise, or a future that forecloses the possibility of conversation and change? I suppose there's a third option too, a future of unease and confusion, of muddled stories like the one I heard at Monticello, of facts half known, truths half said. I remember a line from a satirical underground novel I read as a teenager. A boy asks his father, "Did the year 1937 ever happen? I don't know whom to believe." That year was the height of Stalin's Great Terror. "It hasn't happened yet," the father responds. "It hasn't, my son, but it will." It's still the funniest and most haunting way I've encountered of saying that those who do not face history are doomed to repeat it. And I apologize for this beeping. I just got a new diabetes device, and every so often it does this, and it's driving me crazy. So I hope it didn't drive you crazy. This is Ted. You've been listening to a reading of articles from the New York Times or the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. It's been a real pleasure to read, and I hope you enjoyed listening. And I will speak with you next week. Have a good week. Bye.